My name is Mara Sutton. I'm 37 years old, and on a Tuesday afternoon in October, I sat in my own conference room and watched my husband tell my employees that the business was his now. He had called them together himself. 8 people around a table they had sat at for years, some of them since the day I opened the doors on this place. He stood at the head, my end, the end I had stood at for every all-hands meeting for 11 years, and he used the specific voice he used for things he had already decided: calm, settled. The voice of a man who is not asking anyone's permission because permission, in his understanding, was never required. He said, due to the circumstances with Mara's health, he would be stepping in to manage operations going forward. He said the business was a marital asset and that he had already been in conversation with the right people about the transition. He said he was sure everyone would agree it was the right move and that he was looking forward to working with them. 8 faces around the table. And then, as if someone had arranged it, all 8 of them turned to look at me. I was sitting at the far end of the table, in the chair that guests used when they came in for new client presentations. Not my chair. I had taken the guest chair deliberately because I had known Craig was coming and I had wanted to be in the room when he arrived, and I had wanted him to be able to stand at the head of it without having to move around me. 8 people looked at me. I looked back at them. I looked at Donna Harris, my office manager, who has been with me since the 2nd year, who knows where every file lives and whose voice is the voice that holds the building together on the days I am not in it. Her face was doing a thing I recognized, not surprise. Something past surprise, the way a face looks when it has received information it had already suspected was coming and is now simply confirming. I nodded. One nod, small, the kind that says, I see you and you see me, and we both know what this room contains. Craig was still talking. He said something about continuity and something about the clients, and something about how he understood this was an adjustment. His voice was warm the way voices are warm when they have been rehearsed. He had stood at his father's bathroom mirror that morning. I knew this the way I know his habits. 12 years of marriage accumulate that kind of knowledge like sediment. And he had practiced the announcement until it sounded like leadership rather than what it actually was. What it actually was, I had understood for 3 weeks. But I am getting ahead of myself the way people do when they already know the ending. Let me tell you about Bridwell Creative. I started it in 2013 with $11,000, a rented desk and a shared workspace on 5th Street, and a client list of 3, a bakery, a pediatric dental office, and a small accounting firm that had found me through a mutual contact and was not entirely sure what a communications consultant did but was willing to find out for a reasonable monthly retainer. I did public relations, brand messaging, media strategy, crisis communications. I wrote the sentences that companies used when they needed to be believed. I built reputations from the materials people already had. I just knew which ones to put in the light. By 2019, I had 8 full-time employees and a client roster of 42, ranging from regional nonprofits to 2 publicly traded companies who paid me amounts that still occasionally surprised me when I saw them written on an invoice. The office is on the 2nd floor of a building on Commerce Street. My name is not on the door. Bridwell is my maiden name, the name I gave the business in 2013 before I married Craig in 2015, because I had always known, even at 26 with $11,000 and a rented desk, that whatever I built should have its own name, a name that was not borrowed. I built Bridwell Creative with my hands and my hours, and with the specific skill of a woman who understands that communication is not decoration. It is architecture. It holds things up, or it lets them fall, depending on whether it was built right. Craig Sutton is 41 years old. He sells software solutions for a mid-sized tech firm, which means he sells certainty, the certainty that a product will do what a client needs it to do, and he is good at it in the way that certain people are good at projecting confidence, regardless of what the underlying data supports. I fell in love with that quality when we met. At 30 years old, at a mutual friend's dinner party, I had found his certainty restful, in the way that you find something restful when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and someone offers to hold it for a moment. He did not, in the 12 years that followed, hold very much. Not cruelly. I want to say that clearly because accuracy matters more to me than a clean villain. Craig was not cruel. He was simply built for the performance of presence rather than its substance. He attended the client dinners. He remembered names at the right moments. He knew how to stand next to me at a function and make people believe we were partners in the enterprise, which we were not. The enterprise was mine. His name was on none of the documents that governed it. I had been precise about that in a way that I had never examined too closely, until the diagnosis made examination unavoidable. In February, the mammogram came back with a finding. By March, we had a word for it. By April, we had a treatment plan. I want to tell you that the diagnosis reorganized everything, but that would be imprecise. What it reorganized was my timeline. The things I had been meaning to get around to, I got around to. The documents I had been meaning to formalize, I formalized. I called Frank Keeler in April. He has handled Bridwell Creative's legal matters since 2015. 63 years old, practiced 38 years. The kind of attorney who uses exact language because he has lived long enough to see what happens when the language is approximate. I went to his office on a Thursday afternoon with my treatment plan in one folder and a list of corporate governance changes in another, and I sat across from him, and I told him what I needed. He read the list. He looked at me over his glasses in the way he looks at things he is deciding whether to question. He said, "You're thinking about what happens if you can't run it." I said, "I'm thinking about what happens if someone decides I can't run it before I've made that decision for myself." He understood the distinction. Frank Keeler has handled enough family business disputes to know the difference between a plan for incapacity and a plan for interference. They require different documents. By May, the operating agreement on Bridwell Creative had been updated. The ownership structure was explicit and recorded and placed in the kind of language that does not leave room for interpretation. A specific set of provisions governed who could claim authority over the business under any circumstance and what documentation that would require. Craig Sutton's name appeared in the document exactly once, in a clause that specified he held no ownership interest and no operational authority under any conditions. Frank drafted that clause himself and read it to me over the phone before he filed it, the way he reads anything that is doing the most important work. I said it was correct. He said, "I need you to know that if this goes from the direction you seem to be preparing for, this document is what stops it." I said I knew. He said, "All right then." I went back to treatment. I went back to running Bridwell Creative, from whatever configuration the week allowed, some weeks from the office, some weeks from a laptop on the couch, some weeks through Donna's voice on the phone translating the building to me in the calm, organized language of a woman who understood that keeping the operation running was its own form of loyalty. I lost weight. I lost my hair in August in the specific way that is described in the paperwork, but cannot be fully prepared for. I kept the client calls. I kept the staff meetings. I did not keep the performance of being fine. I dropped that in September, quietly, without announcement, the way you set down something you realize you've been carrying unnecessarily. Craig, in this same period, had been paying attention to something different. He had been paying attention to the revenue reports he occasionally saw on my desk, to the client names he heard mentioned at dinner, to the size of the operation, 8 employees, 42 clients, the numbers in a business that his wife had built from $11,000 in 2013, and that was, by any reasonable assessment, worth considerably more than that now. He had been doing arithmetic. I knew this because Craig's arithmetic has always been visible to me the way certain kinds of weather are visible before they arrive. You feel the pressure change. You read the specific quality of the questions he was asking. About the lease, about the client contracts, about whether the business would need a different kind of leadership structure if my treatment ran long. He was asking the questions of a man who had decided something and was building his justification. In late September, I found on his phone, left open on the kitchen counter, turned face up in the way of someone who has forgotten to manage their information, a text exchange with his brother Ryan. It was 3 messages long. Craig had written, "She's not going to be able to keep running it. It becomes a marital asset in that case. I've been looking into it." Ryan had written back, "Smart, get ahead of it." Craig had written, "Working on it." I read it twice. Then I set the phone back on the counter, face up, exactly as it had been. I went upstairs and I called Frank Keeler. Frank said, "Is the operating agreement up to date?" I said, "Updated in May. You filed it." He said, "Then let him come." I thought about that sentence for 3 weeks. Let him come. 4 words with the specific weight of a document that has already been filed and recorded and placed beyond the reach of anyone who does not have the standing to challenge it. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Craig came. He stood at the head of my conference table, and he made his announcement to my employees in the warm voice he had rehearsed. 8 faces turned to look at me. I nodded. And Craig Sutton, standing at the head of a room that had never been his, smiled the smile of a man who believed he had just walked through an unlocked door, with no understanding at all of who had set the lock. That evening he called his mother and his brother, and they celebrated at the steakhouse on Vine Street. I know because Sandra texted me a photograph of the table without realizing she had sent it to me instead of to her contact group. A table of 4, wine glasses raised. I looked at the photograph for a moment, then I put my phone on the charger and sat in the quiet of my kitchen, in the specific stillness of a woman who has already done what needed to be done and who knows exactly what the morning is going to bring. The first call came at 7:48 in the morning. I know the time because Frank Keeler called me 4 minutes earlier at 7:44, and I was still on the phone with him when Craig's cell phone began ringing on the kitchen counter from a number I could see from where I was sitting. Bridwell Creative's main line. I want to tell you what Frank had just told me because the sequence matters. He had sent the notification letters the previous evening. Not this morning, the previous evening, within 2 hours of the time Craig had stood at the head of my conference table. Frank had prepared them in May, at the same time as the updated operating agreement, and I had told him in October to send them when I called him from upstairs. When I had gone back down to the kitchen and set my phone on the charger and sat in the stillness of knowing what was coming, Frank had been at his desk after hours, printing and signing 2 letters on firm letterhead, one to Craig Sutton directly at our home address, one to the registered agent for Bridwell Creative, which was also me, for the corporate record. The letters described the operating agreement in plain language. They described the ownership structure. They described the specific clause that established Craig had no operational authority and no ownership interest. And they described, in the careful language Frank used for things that needed to be unmistakable, that any individual representing themselves as an officer or owner of Bridwell Creative without documented authority was exposing themselves to civil liability. Frank had sent them certified. They would arrive today. But that was not what his call at 7:44 was about. He said, "Mara, I need you to know what your husband did last night after he left the office." He told me. Craig had sent emails from his personal account after the meeting at 6:17 and 6:43 and 7:02, 3 emails to 3 of Bridwell's largest clients, the ones whose invoices I knew by heart because they were the accounts that had allowed me to grow the staff from 3 to 8. The emails introduced him as the managing partner assuming oversight of Bridwell Creative during my treatment, expressed his commitment to continuity, and asked for a call at their earliest convenience to discuss their accounts. He had sent them before he went to the steakhouse, before the wine glasses were raised. Frank said, "He also called the building management company. I have a contact there. He asked about amending the lease to add his name as a second authorized tenant." I said, "When?" Frank said, "Yesterday afternoon, before the meeting. He was already moving." I sat with that for a moment, The meeting had been his announcement to the staff. The emails and the lease call were the operational infrastructure he had been building around the announcement before it happened. He had sequenced it. First secure the landlord relationship, then announce to the staff, then notify the clients. He had a plan, and the plan had a timeline. Frank said, "There's one more thing." The third thing was the one that changed the temperature of the whole morning. 3 weeks earlier, Craig had contacted a business broker in Cincinnati, a man named Patterson, who specialized in the sale of established small businesses in the communications and marketing sector. Craig had provided basic financial information about Bridwell Creative, information he could have accessed from documents I kept at home, from the revenue conversations I had not thought to guard at my own kitchen table. He had asked Patterson for a preliminary valuation. Patterson had provided one. Craig was not trying to run Bridwell Creative. He was trying to sell it. I looked at the kitchen counter, my phone on its charger, his phone still showing the missed call from our main line, the photograph still in my message history, the steakhouse table, 4 people, wine glasses, Sandra's accidental send. I said, "Frank, the business accounts." He said, "Already contacted the bank this morning. Your sole signature authority is documented. He cannot access or move funds without your written authorization. That was locked the same day we updated the operating agreement." A pause. "But I need you to go into the office today. I need you physically present and documented as the operating principal before end of business, given what he sent to those clients last night." I said, "I'll be there by 9. Donna Harris was already at her desk when I arrived. She had been there since 7:30, which was not unusual. Donna arrived early the way reliable things arrive early, without announcement, simply because the building needed someone in it. She looked up when I came in, and she looked at me the way she had looked at me across the conference table the day before, with the specific steadiness of someone who has already processed what they saw and decided what it meant, and is now simply waiting for the rest of it to arrive. She said, "I need to show you 3 things. The first thing was her inbox. Craig's email, received at 6:43, introducing himself to our largest client as managing partner. Below it, the client's reply, sent at 6:51. "Thank you for the note. Before we proceed, we'd appreciate confirmation from Mara directly that this change is accurate. Please have her reach out at her earliest convenience." They had asked for me. Within 8 minutes of receiving Craig's email, they had asked to hear from me. The second thing was a group text. Donna had created it the previous evening at 7:15, 45 minutes after the meeting, with all 8 Bridwell employees. The message was 3 sentences. "I need everyone to hold on any communications from Craig Sutton regarding clients or operations until we speak. Nothing goes out, nothing gets forwarded, nothing gets confirmed. More tomorrow." 7 of the 8 had responded within 20 minutes. The 8th was Lena, who was on a client site in Cleveland and responded at 11 p.m. when she saw it. All 8 had held. Donna said, "I knew what that nod meant." I looked at her. She said, "In the conference room, when you nodded, I've worked with you for 9 years. That nod meant watch and wait, so we watched and we waited." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Thank the fact that your employees know who built this place." She handed me the third thing, a printed page, a screenshot from a business broker's website, a listing marked preliminary and inactive, but dated 3 weeks ago. Bridwell Creative. Established communications firm, 11 years operating, strong client retention, profitable margin, owner seeking exit due to life circumstances. The listing had not gone active. It was in draft. Patterson, the broker Craig had contacted, had a public-facing portal that showed pending listings to registered investors. Donna said she had found it at 10:30 the previous night. She had printed it and held it and decided to give it to me in person rather than by text, because some things need to be received in the same room as another human being. I sat down at my desk, my actual desk, the one at the end of the hall, and I looked at the preliminary listing for a business that was not Craig's to list. Life circumstances. That was the language he had given the broker for why the owner was seeking exit. I was the life circumstance. Frank arrived at 10. He brought certified copies of the operating agreement, the bank documentation, and the notification letters, and he spread them across the conference table in the order a judge would find them useful. He did not sit. He stood, and he walked me through each document the way he had walked me through them in May, methodically, because the documents were the argument, and the argument needed to be in his hands before Craig's attorney put a counter-argument in theirs. He said Craig had called an attorney. He had found this out through a professional courtesy call, the kind that happens in a small legal market where attorneys know each other's practices. Craig's attorney was a man named Garrett who handled family law and had some business litigation experience. Garrett had called Frank at 9:15. Frank said, "He made the argument that Bridwell Creative is a marital asset and subject to equitable distribution, which is a legitimate argument in a divorce proceeding. He said it the way he says things that require context to understand correctly. Then he gave me the context. He said it is not a legitimate argument for unilateral takeover of a business before any divorce proceedings have been filed, and it does not override a properly documented operating agreement that pre-establishes ownership and authority. What Craig did yesterday constitutes interference with a legally structured entity. What he did last night with the client emails could constitute purchase interference with business relationships. And the broker listing..." He stopped and looked at me over his glasses. "The broker listing is the piece that makes this a different kind of problem for him than he currently understands." I said, "Because he was trying to sell a business he doesn't own." Frank said, "Because he was attempting to arrange the sale of a business he cannot legally transfer. That is not a divorce matter. That is a separate matter with a separate set of consequences." I thought about Craig at the steakhouse, the wine glasses. Get ahead of it. He had been so sure he had gotten ahead of it. He had not known that getting ahead of it had been my project since April, and that his project had begun in the wrong place and was running directly into the infrastructure I had already built. Later that afternoon, Donna came to my office doorway. She had a cup of tea she set on my desk without being asked. She stood for a moment, and then she said the thing she had been deciding whether to say since the morning. She said, "I want you to know something. Last October, when you first told us about the diagnosis, before treatment started, before any of this, I called everyone on the team individually, and I asked them one question. I asked them who they were working for." A pause. She said, 8 out of 8 said your name." I said, "Craig was never in the room at the right moments." She said, "No, he wasn't." She picked up her own mug from the doorframe and went back to her desk. I sat with what she had said for a while. The specific warmth of it and the specific sadness underneath the warmth, because it takes a particular kind of absence to become that invisible to the people who work in a building you walk through regularly. I thought, not for the first time, about a conversation Craig and I had had in the first year of our marriage. He had told me once, over dinner, that his father's landscaping business had collapsed when Craig was 14, that the bank had come for the equipment on a Tuesday, and his father had not come home until Thursday, and when he came home, he had been a different configuration of a person. Craig had said, "I never want to be the one who couldn't hold on to something." He had said it looking at the table. He had not meant it as a confession. He had meant it as a statement of intention. He had built an entire architecture of himself around not being the man who lost the thing. He had just never understood that the way you don't lose a thing is to build it, not to stand next to someone else while they build it and wait for the moment when circumstances might allow you to hold it. I had built Bridwell Creative. He had watched. And when the circumstances arrived, when I got sick and the math of my absence became visible to him, he had reached for the thing the way a man reaches for something that belongs to someone else when he has convinced himself it was always supposed to be his. I was still in my office when Frank called me at 4:47. He said, "Craig is coming home." He said it the way you say something when you know the next part of the story has arrived and the person you are speaking to needs a moment to get ready. I said, "Did Garrett reach out?" Frank said, "Garrett is no longer involved. Craig ended that this afternoon, which means he is coming without an attorney and without a prepared strategy, which is the most important thing I can tell you about what is about to happen." I sat at my desk in the building on Commerce Street in the specific quiet of an office at the end of a long day. Outside my window, the street was doing its late afternoon thing. 8 people in this building had held for me without being asked to hold for long. The documents were in Frank's hands. The accounts were secured. The clients had been reached, individually and personally, with the communication they had asked for. From me, in my voice, brief and accurate. Bridwell Creative was mine, had always been mine, was documented and recorded and placed beyond the reach of anyone who did not have the standing to claim it. Craig was coming home. I drove home. Not because Frank told me to, because sitting in the building I had built while the man who had tried to take it was walking toward our front door felt like the wrong configuration, like waiting for a conversation to find me instead of going to meet it. I got there first. I set my bag on the kitchen counter and I put the kettle on, and I sat at the table. The same table where Craig had left his phone face up in September with the text exchange visible. The same table where I had read his arithmetic and understood what he was building and called Frank Keeler. Craig came in at 5:40. He had his jacket over one arm and his phone in his other hand, and he set both down on the counter in the way of a man who has been rehearsing something in the car and is not sure he has the words right yet. He said, "Before you say anything, I need you to understand where this came from." I said, "Sit down, Craig." He sat. He talked for about 6 minutes. He talked about the treatment, how watching it had been harder than he had anticipated, how the months of it had accumulated into a specific fear that he could not put down, how looking at the revenue and the clients and the staff had felt not like seeing an opportunity, but like seeing something that could collapse if no one was positioned to catch it. He said he had not meant it the way it had looked. He said he had been trying to protect what we had built. What we had built. I let the phrase sit on the table between us. He said, "If you need me to call Garrett back and undo the filing, I can do that. I understand that He stopped. He started again. "I understand that I moved too fast. But I need you to hear that it came from fear, Mara. It came from watching you go through this and not being able to do anything." He looked at the table when he said it. "And the thing I have been thinking about, the thing I want to be precise about because this story is not a simple one, and Craig is not a simple person, is that the fear was real. I believe the fear was real. I believe he looked at cancer and treatment and a business generating significant revenue, and he felt, in the specific way of a man who grew up watching something collapse, the familiar shape of impending loss. And I believe that fear drove him toward the broker and the clients and the staff meeting, the way fear of certain things drives people directly toward them. I believe all of it. I also believe that a man who fears losing something has an obligation to examine whether the thing was his to lose. I took Frank's folder from my bag. I set it on the table, not across from Craig, beside him where he could reach it without it being handed to him. I said, "Open it." He did. The operating agreement first. He read the relevant sections. His name once in the clause that established his authority as non-existent. I watched him read it the way I watched him read things that required more from him than he expected. Then the bank documentation, his access confirmed as none, then the notification letters, his name in the salutation, Frank's firm letterhead, the civil liability language in the 3rd paragraph, then the printout Donna had found, the preliminary broker listing. Established communications firm, 11 years operating, owner seeking exit due to life circumstances. I said, "Life circumstances." He said nothing. I said, "That's what you told Patterson I was, the life circumstance that was causing the exit." He started to speak. I kept my voice at the same level it had been, the one that has no weather in it, because this was not the time for weather. It was the time for the record. I said, You called a broker 3 weeks ago. You provided financial information about a business you do not own and cannot legally transfer. You sent emails last night to our 3 largest clients representing yourself as managing partner. You called the building management company and asked to be added to the lease. I looked at him. You did not ask me if I was okay once this week, Craig. Not once. You sent 3 emails to our clients and you did not ask your wife with cancer how she was. He looked at the table. I said, "That is what the record shows." He said, and it was quiet and it cost him, the way the true things cost when they've been under the managed things for a long time. I've been terrified since February. I don't know how to be terrified. My whole life I have been the person who moves. When my father's business went, I was 14 and I couldn't move. I just watched it go. He looked up. I saw February and I started moving, and I moved in the wrong direction. I know that. I know it now. He said it the way his father might have said something at the end of a week that had not gone the way he expected. Without decoration. I sat with it. Then I said, "Bridwell Creative, do you know why it's Bridwell and not Sutton?" He didn't answer. I said, "Because I named it before I married you. Because I always knew that what I built needed its own name. One that didn't depend on anyone else's. One that would be there regardless of whatever configuration my personal life was in." I looked at the folder on the table. I didn't do that to exclude you. I did it because I understood, even at 26, that the business I was going to build was going to be mine, not ours, mine. And the name was the document I filed with myself before any legal document got filed. He looked at the folder, then at me. I said, "The operating agreement updated in May says the same thing with Frank Keeler's signature on it. The name on the building said it in 2013. I have been consistent about this for 11 years. The only thing that changed in October is that you finally paid attention." He did not argue with it. A man who has read the document and knows what it says does not argue with the document. He sat with it the way people sit with things that are true and uncomfortable and not going anywhere. I said, "You need to call Patterson and close the inquiry. You need to send a follow-up to the 3 clients and tell them your previous email was sent in error. Frank will be in touch with Garrett about the rest." I paused. "Those 3 things happened this week." He said, "And after that." I looked at my husband of 12 years across a table I had owned for 11 of them, and I made the decision I had been circling for 3 weeks. Not the business decision that had been made in May with Frank Keeler. The other one. I said, "We need to talk, not tonight, but soon." He nodded. He understood what the sentence meant, and he did not try to argue it into something smaller. He called Patterson that evening. He sent the client emails the next morning, and I reviewed them before they went out because that is my professional function and because the language mattered, and Craig's language, when he was managing something, tended toward the vague. I tightened them. The clients received clear, accurate corrections. 2 of them responded within the hour to say they were glad to hear from me and they looked forward to our continued work. Here is where everything settled, because you stayed through all of it and the accounting is yours. Frank sent the final documentation to Garrett in November. Craig signed the acknowledgement, his confirmation, on paper, that he held no ownership interest and no operational authority in Bridwell Creative, had never held either, and would not represent otherwise. He signed it at Frank's conference table on a Thursday morning with the same pen he had used to sign our marriage license. I was not there. Frank told me he signed without argument and left quickly, which Frank delivered as a neutral fact, and which I received the same way. The marriage did not survive the winter. I want to say that plainly, because it is true, and because this is not a story where everything comes back together and calls it a resolution. We separated in January. Craig moved to an apartment in Kenwood. We talk occasionally, in the careful language of 2 people who are past the thing they were and have not yet decided what they are now. I do not hate him. I understand him, which is different from forgiving him and different from excusing him, and sits in a space that I am still learning to inhabit. Donna Harris got a raise in January, an actual raise, the kind I had been planning to give her in the 4th quarter and had not gotten to. She said thank you and went back to her desk and did not make it into more than it was, which is exactly how Donna receives good things and why she has been in that building for 9 years. The 8 employees are still 8. We added a 9th in March, a junior account coordinator named Amy, who came in for her interview nervous and left with an offer because she asked, in the last 5 minutes of the meeting, not what the job would do for her career, but what the clients needed most. I hired her for the question. Frank Keeler sent me a card in February, a real one, handwritten on his firm's stationery. It said, "You were ready before the circumstances required you to be." That is the rarest thing in this work. I put it in the frame above my desk where I used to have a motivational print that had never said anything true. Frank's sentence is truer than anything on that print ever was. The 3 clients Craig emailed are still clients. The largest of them, the one who had replied within 8 minutes asking to hear from me directly, extended their retainer in December for an additional 2 years. Their general counsel told me over the phone that they had made the decision based on the way I had handled October. She said, "You were in treatment and you handled it with more precision than most healthy people manage on a good day." I said I had good documentation. She laughed. She said, "That's what I mean." Bridwell Creative is still Bridwell Creative. The name is still on the door and not on the door. There's no signage on the door of the second-floor office that names me personally, because I have always understood that the business and the person who runs it are separate instruments. The business can survive circumstances. The person inside it may change configuration. The separation is the structural integrity. I went back to full schedule in February, my treatment ended in December, and the quarterly follow-ups are what they are. Appointments I attend with a notebook, because attending things with a notebook is how I attend things, and some habits are the whole infrastructure. On the last day of October, 1 year exactly from the afternoon Craig stood at the head of my conference table, I was in the building on Commerce Street at 7:30 in the morning. The early October light was doing what October light does when it comes through east-facing windows, flat and honest, the kind that makes things look like what they actually are. I stood in the conference room alone for a moment before the day started. I looked at the chair at the head of the table, my end, the end I had stood at for 11 years, where I had run every all-hands meeting, where I had watched 8 faces turn toward me last October when a man who didn't understand what he was standing in had made his announcement. I sat down at the head of the table, not performing it, not for anyone, just sitting in the chair that had been mine since 2013, and that had always been mine, and that documentation had confirmed, and that 8 people and 1 very good attorney had helped me hold in the months when holding it had been the hardest work I had done. Some people will wait for your worst moment to reach for what you built. They will call it protection. They will call it practicality. They will call it love sometimes, in the voice that has been rehearsed in front of the bathroom mirror, and the only answer that holds, the only one that outlasts the taking, is the one you filed before they arrived. Build the thing, name it correctly, put it in the right hands, and stay in the room. If this story spoke to you, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more stories of betrayal, strength, and quiet revenge. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd love to know where you're listening from today. I'll see you in the next one.